Sign here, sir. You have 30 days to vacate. That's what the young bank officer said as he slid the final foreclosure notice across James Mason's kitchen table. He didn't look up, didn't even try to hide his smirk. James didn't argue. He just kept both hands flat on the table, steady, silent, and wrinkled with decades of work. You might want to check the cellar first, he said quietly. The officer chuckled, adjusting his silk tie. The cellar? We've assessed every inch of this property, Mr. Mason. There's nothing here worth saving. An hour later, 3 state government vehicles pulled up the dusty driveway. When the director of historical preservation stepped out, she didn't offer pleasantries. She pointed at the bank officials and said 6 words. You almost auctioned off American history. If that hits you deep, comment preserve for every hidden treasure still waiting to be discovered in America's forgotten places. The bank officials stood frozen, their faces pale as the director's team rushed past them toward the old cellar doors. Neighbors gathered at the property edge, whispering as official-looking people carried special cases and equipment. By sunset, the foreclosure notice lay forgotten on the table, and the bank president himself was on the phone, stammering apologies. No one had bothered to look beneath the surface of the worthless family farm until today. James Mason, 78, was simply trying to save the family farm. His grandfather had broken ground here in 1902, and the maple tree out front had witnessed 3 generations of Mason children grow up beneath its branches. The farmhouse needed paint, the barn roof sagged in the middle, but this land was James's heart and soul. That morning he checked his mailbox to find the final notice. Foreclosure proceedings. Final warning. 3 years of drought had dried up his crops and his savings. The bank had run out of patience. A mile down the road, the First National Bank sign gleamed in the morning sun, its new glass building a stark contrast to the weathered wood of James's home. James sat at his kitchen table, running his calloused fingers over the foreclosure papers. His hands bore the marks of 70 years of farm work, each scar and callus earned through dawn to dusk labor. On the wall hung photos of his father and grandfather standing proudly in these same fields. In the corner stood the antique grandfather clock that had never left this house, still ticking away the family's time on the land. James wore faded overalls and a flannel shirt with patches on both elbows. No one ever noticed him in town, and that's how he preferred it. His truck, a 1976 Ford pickup, had more rust than paint, but still ran because he fixed it himself. The local kids called him Old Man Mason, never realizing they were looking at living history. The Mason farm had once been the pride of Springfield County. His grandfather had arrived with nothing but a mule and a dream in 1902. During the Great Depression, this farm had fed half the county. James's father had modernized in the 50s, buying their first tractor by saving every penny for 3 years. James himself had put 3 children through college with corn, wheat, and smart management. But times had changed. Big agriculture corporations had squeezed out family farms. Then came 3 years of the worst drought in living memory. James's savings vanished, keeping the place running. His children had careers in distant cities, a doctor, a teacher, and an engineer, all successful, all with lives of their own. He'd never told them how bad things had gotten, never mentioned the letters from the bank that started arriving monthly, then weekly. Every morning, James still rose at 4:30 a.m., still walked his property line, still tended what crops he could save with their limited water. His wife Martha had passed 5 years ago, but he still set 2 places at breakfast out of habit, then quietly removed the second plate before sitting down to eat alone. The knock came precisely at 9, 3 bank representatives in press suits that had never seen a day of real work. Mr. Mason, the leader said with practiced sympathy, we're here to conduct the final assessment before the auction date is set. James nodded, opening his door wider. Do what you need to do. His voice was soft but steady. The youngest bank officer, barely 30 with slicked back hair, whispered to his colleague, could probably buy this whole place for the price of my watch. They thought James couldn't hear. He heard everything. Let me show you around, James offered, leading them through rooms filled with memories. The kitchen where Martha had canned vegetables every fall. The living room where his children had opened Christmas presents. The small office where he'd tracked 60 years of crop yields in leather-bound ledgers. We'll need to see everything, the senior officer said, tapping notes into his tablet. Outbuildings, equipment, acreage. His tone suggested he was doing James a favor by being thorough. There's the cellar too, James mentioned casually. Been in the family since the beginning. The lead officer barely looked up. Root cellars don't add value in today's market. Mr. Mason, we're more interested in the tillable acreage. All morning they measured, photographed, and appraised. They ran their manicured fingers along windowsills, commenting on needed repairs. They stepped carefully around mud puddles, their leather shoes unsuited for farm life. The oldest officer at least had the decency to look uncomfortable as they listed James's possessions like items at a garage sale. Equipment's outdated, one noted. Irrigation system's inefficient, added another. House needs complete renovation, concluded the third. James followed silently. Each dismissive comment struck like a physical blow, but his expression never changed. He'd survived dust storms, hailstorms, and market crashes. He could survive this too. At lunch, they sat in their luxury SUV with the air conditioning running, eating sandwiches from town while looking over his property. Through the tinted windows, James could see them laughing. One pointed at his old tractor, miming its slow pace. A neighbor drove past, honked in support. Around town, word had spread about the Mason foreclosure. People shook their heads in sympathy, but sympathy didn't pay bank loans. The local diner had started a collection jar that had gathered barely enough to cover 1 month's interest. Mr. Mason, the senior banker said as afternoon shadows grew long, I'll be honest with you. The auction will likely attract developers, not farmers. This land will probably become part of the new suburban housing project. James looked out across fields his family had worked for over a century. And the house? Likely demolished, came the casual reply. Land's worth more than the structures. I see, James said quietly. You've checked everything then? Every relevant asset, the banker confirmed, already extending the paperwork. Sign here to acknowledge our assessment. Auction date will be 4 weeks from today. James paused, his weathered hand hovering over the paper. Except the cellar. The youngest banker sighed dramatically. Mr. Mason, we've been through this. Root cellars aren't significant assets. This one might surprise you, James insisted softly. We're on a schedule, sir, the banker replied, tapping his watch. We have 2 more foreclosures to process today. James signed the paper. They didn't even thank him before driving away, leaving a cloud of dust from his own driveway settling over him as he stood alone. That evening at Donnie's diner, the youngest banker loudly recounted their visit to the Mason farm. Old man couldn't accept reality, kept insisting we inspect his cellar, like we'd find buried treasure or something. His companions laughed, clinking their coffee mugs. In the next booth, Sarah Winters, the county historian, lowered her newspaper. She'd been researching local properties for months for the county's bicentennial. The Mason farm had been on her list, but James had always politely declined interviews. Now she understood why. Excuse me, she approached their table. Did you say you were at the Mason place today? The original homestead from 1902? The banker barely glanced up. Yeah, another sad case. Old farms can't compete anymore. Did you happen to examine the cellar Mr. Mason mentioned? Lady, we assessed a dozen properties this week. We don't have time to rummage through dusty root cellars full of canned peaches, the senior banker replied dismissively. Sarah returned to her booth, immediately pulling out her phone. The next morning, James began the painful process of sorting through 120 years of family history. He carefully wrapped his grandmother's china and newspaper. He boxed his children's school awards. In the study, he paused at the leather-bound family Bible, tracing the names recorded inside, 5 generations of Masons. Behind it on the shelf sat a small wooden box his father had given him on his deathbed 30 years ago. Inside lay yellowed papers and a tarnished key. His father's final words echoed in his memory. The farm might not always be ours, James, but what's below must be protected. Promise me. He'd promised. And for 3 decades, he'd kept that promise, even as the farm struggled and failed around him. The cellar remained sealed except for his monthly inspections, preserving what lay within. James's nearest neighbor, Bill Harmon, drove over that afternoon in his pickup. Heard the bankers were here yesterday, he said, leaning against the porch rail. Those vultures set a date yet? James nodded. 4 weeks. Ain't right what they're doing to family farms, Bill said, spitting into the dirt. My cousin's fighting the same battle up in Harrison County. It's business, James replied without bitterness. Talked to my brother-in-law at the bank, Bill continued. Said they're already courting those developers from the city, planning to break ground on 200 houses before Christmas. James stared across the fields, golden in the afternoon light. 200 houses where corn once grew. I tried talking to them, James. Told them about your family's history here. They just quoted policy at me. As Bill drove away, James noticed a car he didn't recognize parked at his gate. A woman with a notebook stood beside it, taking pictures. The county historian. She waved but didn't approach. James nodded politely and went back inside. That night after midnight, James took a lantern down to the cellar. The heavy doors creaked open to reveal steep stone steps descending into darkness. The air below was cool and dry, preserved by the dehumidifiers he maintained religiously. He moved past the expected shelves of canned goods and gardening supplies to the far wall, where a second door remained hidden behind stacked crates. The tarnished key from his father's box fit perfectly in the lock. Inside this second chamber, James inspected everything carefully, as he'd done monthly for 30 years. Nothing had changed. Nothing had deteriorated. The family's true legacy remained intact, waiting for the right moment. James wasn't sure if that moment would ever come, but he'd kept his promise. 3 days before the scheduled final inspection, a line of luxury cars pulled into the Mason driveway. Bank executives and men in expensive suits emerged, measuring the fields with professional equipment and discussing building plans loudly enough for James to hear through his open kitchen window. They walked the property line, hammered small flags into his soil, and never once acknowledged his presence on his own porch. The clubhouse would work nicely on that rise, one said, pointing. These old trees will have to go, of course, added another. Prime location for the model homes, concluded a third. They didn't bother knocking on his door before they left. The day of the final inspection arrived with a summer storm threatening on the horizon. Dark clouds gathered as 3 bank officials and 2 representatives from the development company pulled into James's driveway. Their leather portfolios and digital tablets contrasted sharply with the weathered farm buildings around them. "Morning, Mr. Mason," the senior banker said without warmth. "This is the final walkthrough before the property transfers. We've brought the developers to begin preliminary planning." James nodded silently from his porch rocker. Let them look. Let them measure. Let them plan. The youngest banker, the one with the slicked back hair, had been assigned to check the house's foundation. He circled the structure, making notes, occasionally knocking on walls. When he reached the cellar doors, he paused. "These secured?" he called to James. "Never locked," James replied. The banker pulled the doors open, revealing stone steps descending into shadow. He clicked on his phone's flashlight and started down, expecting a quick inspection of a dusty, forgotten space. James watched the clock on the wall. 3 minutes passed. 5, 10. "Hey, guys?" The banker's voice echoed from below, an unusual tone in his normally confident speech. "You might want to see this." The senior banker sighed dramatically. "We're on a schedule, Mark." "No, seriously, you need to see this right now." Something in his voice made them pause. One by one, they descended into the cellar. James remained on the porch, watching clouds gather. Thunder rumbled in the distance. 20 minutes later, they emerged with wide eyes and hushed voices. The development representative kept checking his phone, making hurried calls. The senior banker approached James, his expression completely transformed. "Mr. Mason," he began, struggling to maintain his professional composure, "there seems to be, that is to say, how long has that collection been down there?" "Since the Revolution," James answered simply. "My family's been keeping it safe for 7 generations." The collection they'd discovered behind the hidden door wasn't just old farming tools or family heirlooms. The Mason cellar contained one of the most significant undocumented collections of American Revolutionary War artifacts and documents in private hands. Uniforms worn at Valley Forge, letters signed by Washington himself, maps drawn by colonial scouts, weapons carried at Yorktown, an original broadside printing of the Declaration of Independence. "These items belong in a museum," the developer whispered, still in shock. "They belong to history," James corrected quietly. "My great-great-great-grandfather was an aide to General Washington. When the British burned Washington, D.C. in 1814, he was entrusted with preserving these items. The Mason family has kept that trust ever since." While they stood in stunned silence, cars began arriving. First came Sarah Winters, the county historian, then representatives from the State Historical Society. Someone had alerted them after overhearing the bankers at the diner. Within an hour, the dusty farm driveway held a dozen vehicles, including 3 with government plates. A woman in a crisp blazer approached James with an outstretched hand. "Mr. Mason, I'm Dr. Catherine Reynolds, Director of the State Historical Preservation Office. We received an urgent call about significant historical artifacts. The bank officials shifted uncomfortably as experts descended into the cellar with proper equipment, specialized lights, archival gloves, humidity meters. The storm had arrived now, rain pattering on the roof as people hurried between vehicles and the house. Inside the hidden chamber, historians cataloged with growing excitement. This uniform shows signs of the Valley Forge winter. These letters contain previously unknown correspondence with Lafayette. This map shows troop movements never documented in other collections. Outside, news vans began arriving. Neighbors parked along the road and walked up the driveway, gathering under umbrellas. The story was spreading faster than the summer storm. Old Man Mason's farm contained priceless American history. The bank president himself arrived, having been called by his increasingly nervous employees. He pulled the senior banker aside, their heated whispers carrying across the porch. "You were going to auction this property without a proper historical assessment?" "Sir, we followed standard procedure for agricultural foreclosures." "Standard procedure?" "There's a first-hand account of Bunker Hill in that cellar." James sat quietly in his rocker, watching the rain. Dr. Reynolds joined him, still wearing archival gloves. "Mr. Mason," she said with genuine respect, "do you understand what you have here? This collection is easily worth millions. It contains items historians thought were lost forever." "I understand," he replied softly. "My father understood. His father understood. It was never about the money. Why didn't you tell anyone? This could have saved your farm years ago." James looked out at the fields his family had worked for generations. Some promises matter more than property. We were entrusted with history. Selling it to save ourselves wasn't an option. The rain fell harder as experts continued to emerge from the cellar with carefully wrapped items, their faces showing a mixture of awe and professional excitement. The developers had retreated to their car, their plans for suburban homes suddenly complicated by national heritage. In the crowd of gathering onlookers, someone began to applaud. Others joined in, a slow crescendo of respect washing over the old farmer who had guarded America's secrets beneath his struggling farm. By evening, the rain had stopped, but people kept coming. Neighbors brought folding chairs and food, casseroles, pies, and thermoses of coffee. They set up an impromptu gathering under the old maple tree where generations of Mason children had played. The farm that had been silently dying now pulsed with life and conversation. Local news crews interviewed wide-eyed historians. "This is the most significant private collection of Revolutionary-era artifacts discovered in the last 50 years, one expert explained to cameras. "It's as if a time capsule from the founding of our nation has been preserved intact." James sat among his neighbors, accepting a plate of food from Mrs. Henderson from the church. "James Mason," she said, shaking her head in wonder, "keeping such a secret all these years." Old Bill Thompson, who'd lived down the road for 70 years, spoke up. "I remember your father checking that cellar every month like clockwork, rain or shine, sick or well, never knew why." "My grandfather did the same," Mr. Collins added. "Dad always said the Masons were keepers of something special, but we thought it was just talk." As the crowd shared stories, people began connecting scattered memories. The Mason farm had always been different. During wars, when metal was being collected for the effort, the Masons had contributed, but never allowed anyone into their cellar. During the Depression, when farms were being searched for valuables, the Masons had kept their cellar locked while feeding hungry neighbors from their fields. Sarah Winters, the county historian, had set up a table where she showed people carefully selected items from her research archives. "The Mason family appears repeatedly in local records," she explained. "Always respected, never wealthy, but always protected somehow. Town records show that even during the hardest times, there were always exceptions made for this property." The bank president stood awkwardly at the edge of the gathering, his expensive suit out of place among work clothes and casual wear. The development company representatives had long since departed, their blueprints for Mason Meadows subdivision rolled up and forgotten on the back seat of their car. Dr. Reynolds from the Historical Society approached the banker, her voice carrying so others could hear. "I assume the foreclosure proceedings will be suspended immediately, given the national significance of this site." The banker cleared his throat. "Of course, we're reviewing all options in light of today's discoveries." "Reviewing options?" A voice rose from the crowd, James's neighbor Bill. "You were ready to bulldoze American history yesterday." Murmurs of agreement spread through the gathering. Someone had set up a live stream on social media, and comments were flooding in from across the country. Save Mason Farm was already trending. The banker raised his hands defensively. The bank certainly had no knowledge of the historical artifacts. Mr. Mason never disclosed. "I tried," James interrupted, his quiet voice somehow carrying across the yard. Everyone fell silent. "3 times I mentioned the cellar. 3 times I was told it wasn't relevant." "But you never specifically stated," the banker began. "Some things aren't meant to be shouted," James replied. "My family has protected these items through 12 wars, 6 economic depressions, and countless storms. We didn't survive by putting advertisements in the newspaper." An elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd, Martha Jenkins, the town's oldest resident at 93. "My grandmother told me stories," she said in a wavering voice, "about how during the Civil War, when both armies were requisitioning supplies, the Masons were somehow always spared. She said they were guardians of something precious from the beginning. We all thought it was just a legend." Dr. Reynolds nodded. "Many communities have such legends. What's remarkable is that this one proved true. The Mason family has preserved vital pieces of American history that might otherwise have been lost forever." The bank president stepped forward, finally sensing the public relations disaster unfolding. "On behalf of First National Bank, I want to assure everyone that we fully support the preservation of historical treasures. We will be immediately suspending all foreclosure actions on this property pending a full historical assessment." James sat quietly, watching the man who weeks earlier had refused his calls now bowing to public pressure. Someone had brought him a cup of coffee, which he held in his weathered hands that had planted crops, fixed machinery, and carefully preserved history. "Mr. Mason," a young reporter asked, thrusting a microphone toward him, "how does it feel to have saved your family farm?" James looked around at the gathering, at neighbors who'd known him all his life but never known his family's secret, at historians handling with reverence items his ancestors had protected through generations, at bankers who'd dismissed him only yesterday. "This farm was never just about the land," he said finally. "What matters isn't what we keep for ourselves, but what we protect for others. My family has always understood that some treasures belong to everyone." A spontaneous applause broke out, spreading across the yard. In the distance, more cars were arriving, headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. By the following week, the Mason farm had transformed. State historical preservation officials had set up climate-controlled temporary structures to properly catalog and preserve the collection. The foreclosure notices had been formally withdrawn, replaced by historical designation paperwork that would protect the property in perpetuity. News outlets from around the country sent reporters to the small farm that had suddenly become famous. "American Treasures Hidden in Plain Sight," read one headline. "Farmer Saves History," while "History Saves Farm," proclaimed another. The governor arrived for a formal ceremony, standing on James's front porch to announce the creation of the Mason Family Historical Preservation Trust, with an initial state grant of $500,000 to maintain both the collection and the farm. "This site will now serve as both a working historical farm and a museum," the governor declared to applause. "Future generations will learn not only about our revolutionary history, but about the remarkable family who protected it for nearly 2 centuries." James was appointed honorary curator, a position that came with a modest salary, his first steady income in years. The fields would continue to be farmed using traditional methods as part of the living history experience. The cellar would become the centerpiece of a dedicated museum space. Mark Davis, the young banker who had first discovered the collection, returned to the farm alone one evening. James found him standing by the old maple tree, looking out over the fields. "Mr. Mason," he said, extending his hand, "I came to apologize. I was arrogant and dismissive." James accepted the handshake. "You were doing your job as you understood it." "That's just it," Mark replied. "I didn't understand my job at all. I was so focused on property values and development potential that I never considered what this land really meant." In the weeks that followed, First National Bank announced a new Heritage Property Initiative, providing special considerations for historical farms and properties throughout the region. Mark Davis was appointed to lead it, with Sarah Winters from the County Historical Society as consultant. Local schools began scheduling field trips to the Mason farm. Children who had once whispered about the crazy old farmer now sat attentively as James explained how crops were grown in the 1800s, how his ancestors had preserved food without refrigeration, and how one family's promise had protected pieces of America's birth. The most valuable things, he told them, often don't look valuable at all. That's how they survive. The collection itself exceeded even the experts' initial assessments. Beyond the Revolutionary War artifacts, the Masons had preserved items from every major period in American history. Civil War letters, Spanish-American War photographs, and World War I diaries, all carefully maintained and documented across generations. It wasn't just about the Revolution, James explained to Dr. Reynolds as they cataloged items. My family believed in preserving the whole American story, the triumphs and the struggles. 1 year later, James still rose at 4:30 each morning. He still walked his property line before breakfast. But now he wasn't alone. Graduate students in historical preservation worked alongside him, learning techniques his father had taught him for maintaining the delicate balance between farming the land and preserving its treasures. The barn housed both modern conservation equipment and the antique farm tools his grandfather had used. Where developers had once planned to build a clubhouse, visitors now gathered under a pavilion to hear James and visiting historians speak about the connection between American agriculture and American freedom. The bank that had almost foreclosed now featured the Mason farm story prominently in their advertising, emphasizing their commitment to preserving community heritage. The same bank president who had refused James's calls now brought important visitors to tour the property, always careful to give James the respect he had once withheld. On warm evenings, James still sat on his porch in the rocking chair his father had made. But now he often had company, neighbors, historians, or curious visitors who stayed after closing hours to hear his stories. You could have sold those artifacts decades ago, a visitor once observed. You could have been rich. James smiled gently. Some wealth isn't measured in dollars. My family was never rich in money, but we were rich in purpose. The cellar doors remained open now, leading visitors down to carefully designed exhibits. The hidden room that had once been sealed to all but the Mason family now educated thousands about America's beginnings. School buses arrived daily, discharging children who raced each other to see the treasures below the ordinary farm. And when those children returned to their buses at day's end, they often passed James in his fields, still farming the land his ancestors had worked, still preserving something precious for generations yet to come. If this story touched you, subscribe to our channel and comment "Preserve" for every hidden treasure waiting to be discovered in your own community's forgotten places. Because true value doesn't rust, it just patiently waits to be recognized.